Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I am the Executive Director of Learning and Applied Improvisation at the Second City. I'm here with Kim Scott, and let's go over the agenda before we jump into our content. The first thing we're going to do is talk about this idea of checking in, and I'm going to hold that for a second because we're going to do it. Then we're going to talk about the Radical Candor framework, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into what we mean when we say you should have an improv mindset, especially in a crisis. And then we're going to talk about how to lead, collaborate, and stay connected inside a crisis. And there's three sort of areas we're going to cover: building trust through caring and challenging, transparency and authenticity, and give you some practical tips that you can put into practice. So, Kim, one of the things that you and I have talked about is this importance, especially right now, of what it means to check in. So how are you?
Things are much better. Things are looking up today. My husband was quarantined, was isolated in our house. He went down to this little room off the garage, and I was kind of slipping food onto the top of the stairs above the garage, and he was creeping up to get it. And obviously, I was pretty sure he was okay, but it's always a worry. And I just missed him, and I missed his help as well. So I'm really happy to report that he has no fever and is back up with us.
Good. So I'm in the attic of my home in the northwest side of Chicago, which is where I've been working. So if you hear a bark or two, that is my 100-pound Bernese mountain dog named Benchley. Because that happens. And I'm doing okay. I mean, literally the last 2 weeks have been Second City taking a 60-year-old live entertainment and training company and turning it into an online entertainment and training company. But it's actually kind of working. We have 80% retention in our students for our training center, and we're going to start doing shows on Zoom, hopefully as soon as next week. It's
amazing.
It is it's scared like everyone's scared, but also sort of marveling at the ways people are coming together. And Kim, you and I touched on this morning, right? When we were looking at Twitter, and
yes.
There's a academic out there who said that actually in a crisis, more people do behave well than don't.
Yeah, so I think thank you for sharing that with me this morning. It was very comforting, because I think one of my anxieties is the social fabric going to come unraveled. And the evidence is that it will actually be strengthened by the crisis. It won't be weakened.
Yeah, I think that's an important way to enter it. And it's not to minimize people's suffering. It is not to, not pay attention to the stark reality, which is not good. But as human beings, we know that we do not operate at our best when we're in our fear brain. That is not the way that we operate best. So much better to work from a growth mindset that's very akin to an improv mindset. And then it calls for this level of clarity in communication, which is total radical candor. So I think that's probably the best place for us to start, is just giving a sort of framework for those people who might not know what radical candor is.
Great. So the idea of radical candor is actually really simple. It's about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. And I think the good news is that I've seen some of the best examples of this that I've ever seen, both from leaders and also from the guy who was checking me out at the grocery store the other day, like where people really take a moment to do what you just did for me, Kelly, and to check in with one another, but also to say when they need some help. So for example, the radical candor I got in the grocery store was the guy who was checking me out was like, bag the groceries yourself, which I should have figured out myself, but I needed him to tell me. So that was a little radical candor, and I appreciated it. And then as I was bagging, we had this very kind of intimate and satisfying conversation about how our respective families were doing. So a small example of radical candor in the moment. However, it's also important to understand what radical candor is not. We said that very often a crisis brings out the very best in people, but occasionally it brings out the worst. And I think it's more important than ever to learn how to hold up a mirror to people when the crisis is bringing out their worst. So one of the things that happens very often when we're stressed out is we act in a way that I call obnoxious aggression. That's where you do challenge someone else, but you fail to tell them that you really care. So I was trying to get my kids to help me vacuum before I came up here, and I'm afraid I fell into the obnoxious aggression quadrant, even though on the other day when we talked. I promised I wouldn't do that, and that time it was over the dishes. So it's so easy when we're stressed out, there's a lot going on, to remember to challenge people, but to forget to show them that we care. And I think that more now than ever, it's important to start with that sort of reminder to ourselves and to others of our shared humanity, and to take a moment to show we care. Not forever, but just a moment to show that you care. Now, sometimes what happens in a crisis is kind of the opposite of obnoxious aggression. It's what I call ruinous empathy. And that's where we're so concerned about the people around us, and we realize that they are stretched to their limits. And so we don't tell them something that they really need to know. We don't ask them for the help that we really need. Like, I really needed my kids to help me with the vacuuming. I couldn't do it all and get up here at the same time. And so I think it's really important in a time of crisis to remember, yes, your compassion is so important, and your truth is equally as important. If you sort of abstract radical candor out to its most abstract level, it's about love and truth at the same time. So ruinous empathy is what happens when you do remember to show love, but you forget about the importance of sharing your truth. And last but not least, there's manipulative insincerity. And this is the very worst way to respond to a crisis, although it's also very human. So we need to have compassion for ourselves and not use this framework to judge ourselves or to judge other people. But manipulative insincerity is what happens when we don't say what needs saying, and we forget to show that we care about the other person. We just kind of pull into our shell turtle-like. And of course, we all need to do that from time to time. We need a little bit of self-care, but don't forget to reemerge from your shell and to see the people around you and to show them that you love them. Shower the people you love with love like never before. But love is not all we need. We also need truth. Tell them the truth about what's going on. Does that make sense, Kelly?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know that this isn't static conditions, right?
Yes.
All of us are floating between these at any given time, which is why understanding that when you do fall into obnoxious aggression, it's going to happen. So then you can pivot and move into the more care personally. So you can move from obnoxious aggression to radical candor if you grab onto your care, and the person across from you knows that you care, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think it's also important to remember that you want to move in the right direction, not in the wrong direction when you find yourself in a quadrant you don't want to be in. So very often when we realize we've acted like a jerk, the temptation is to move the wrong direction on challenge directly rather than moving the right direction on care personally. So if you realize you've been a jerk, don't pretend like say, oh, I didn't really mean it. It's no big deal if it is a big deal, but do take a moment to show that you care.
So one of the reasons I think it's important to understand that these aren't static conditions is because that's a thing improvisation does.
Yes.
It is a practice in a world that is constantly being written in the moment. So, when groups of people are making something out of nothing, that's a very, very hard thing to do. So we have all this training and these exercises in these practices, and they teach people to see all obstacles as gifts. They make mistakes work for you. We have the notion that all of us are better than one of us. And we have a concept called follow the follower, which in essence is a servant leadership model.
We need to learn how to change the way that we talk at work, and actually it works just as well at home as well. But it's hard to do. Most of us have been taught since we learned to speak, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And it's easy for me to say to everybody out there, be radically candid, but it's really hard for them to do it. It's really hard for you, all of you out there, to actually undo training that's been pounded into your head since you learned to speak. And so what I want to do, what we wanted to do with the feedback loop, this comedy series that we created, is show not only the right things to do, but also how we all screw it up, because we do screw it up all the time. And it was really fun, Kelly, working with your team to bring it to life. One of the things,
also one of the vehicles that we haven't talked about, we've talked a lot about improvisation, but not so much about comedy. And the reality is, one of the reasons that we wanted to use comedy is it is a very memorable way to get your message across. This is why so many Super Bowl ads are comedy ads. But the reality too is there are so many people producing comedy ads who are not experts in comedy. I don't understand how people are allowed to, produce this kind of comedy without a license. And at Second City, we've all undergone immense training. I mean, just years and years of practice in front of audiences crafting comic messages. And when it is done well, the results are amazing. We're just launching a new digital learning product. It's called the Feedback Loop. And it comes along with a cheat sheet and a playbook that help you playfully practice the things you're learning in the series. So we're going to give you a chance to see the trailer.
I have become enamored with Swedish culture. This is Fjord, time-traveling wood nymph from the black forests of Flarmville.
We're repeating the same day over and over. What the hell is happening?
Okay, where do we keep starting over?
This is Fjord. Let's get radical.
I think that's the key to this whole thing. We have to practice radical candor.
Damn it! Dill, you're doing a great job. I'm stuck. Thank you for the candor.
Feels like you're constantly criticizing you.
What? I haven't really known what you've been talking about.
I'm worried I was a little vague and insincere.
Let's just keep praising them. It's positive. How could that be bad?
If you can say it to a dog, it's not really praise.
Okay, poster child for radical candor. Show me how it's done.
What do you want, Robert? You know how hard it is to find business chaps?
I'm sorry, what are you talking about?
My profiteroles!
Wonderful, Chuck.
It's the bone broth that makes the Swedish meatball.
Okay, Boomer.
We may break the cycle this time.
Anybody have a vacuum?
Just a little ready candy.
Ew.
I apologize for that one.
My favorite line in that by far is, if you can say it to a dog, it's not really praise.
How many times have we gotten that? Like, good job. And it doesn't feel good to get that kind of praise. So let's think about what that means for your leadership and how to build trust as a leader. Challenging others and encouraging them to challenge you helps build trusting relationships, because it shows, one, you care enough to point out both the things that aren't going well and those that are, and two, that you are willing to admit when you're wrong and that you're committed to fixing mistakes that you or others have made. But because challenging often involves disagreeing or saying no, this approach embraces conflict rather than avoiding it. So it's so tempting in a crisis to avoid conflict, but resolving conflict and resolving it quickly is one of the things that we can do to build trust.
So in improvisation, trust is at the root of our ensemble. So we don't use the word team, we use the term ensemble, which implies that there are values, ethics, and behaviors that everyone has to adhere to in order for the group to be successful. Everyone's probably heard the phrase, your group is only as good as its weakest member. We don't believe that. What we believe is your group is only as good as its ability to compensate for its weakest member. Because at any point, one of us is going to be the weakest member. I mean, if you start throwing math problems at me, I am the weakest member. If you want me to talk about improv, I'm not the weakest member. But, again, we don't live in static times. And especially we know that in a crisis. And I think it was Ernest Hemingway, who said the best way to find out if you can trust someone is to trust them.
Yes.
Starting with intent, thinking good intent. We very often move into our fear brain. That is how we were built. We have been running on the savannah much longer than we've been running for the bus, right? So we're built in to recognize these dangers. So when you know that, you need to do the switch. And I love this phrase, replace blame with curiosity. But that's often a very hard and tricky thing to navigate. I think of the study that Amy Edmondson did, and she coined the term psychological safety, which is all about trust. So she was a grad student at Harvard, and they were studying high performance nursing teams at this hospital outside of Boston. And they had assumed that the highest performing teams would make the fewest mistakes. But what they discovered was actually the highest performing team made the most mistakes. So she had to dig in and figure out what was going on. And it took her a little while, but then what she figured out was it wasn't that the lowest performing teams were making the fewest mistakes, it's that they weren't reporting their mistakes at all. So this is at the root, one of the worst things that can happen in a crisis, or frankly, anytime, is organizational silence. And radical candor itself is the enemy of organizational silence. And I think this, our marriage of sort of improv practice and radical candor theory is what makes this like a superpower in my mind. So let's also talk about the next thing that we had here, which is transparency and authenticity. Kim, where do you come down on that? What's important about that?
So transparency, showing what you do know, is so important, especially right now. The leaders who are sharing the facts and figures with their teams are the leaders who are building trust with their teams. The leaders who are saying, I'm going to show you exactly our runway. I'm going to show you, how much money we have so that we can all develop a plan to move through this crisis together, are the teams that are really coming together to come up with the most innovative solutions. So I think that transparency is really vital in terms of information. I also think that privacy is important in terms of building relationships. So taking the time to have those private conversations, those one-on-one meetings, which we'll talk about later, is also really important. At the same time, authenticity is really important, equally as important as transparency.
Yeah, I mean, vulnerability is a strength.
Yeah.
I don't understand when people don't. It takes courage to be vulnerable. And we know from our work with the behavioral science community, human beings desire to be seen and heard. That is what they're looking for. Nature abhors a vacuum. And in times like this, people assume silence equals bad news. It instills fear. But when leaders are transparent and authentic, their teams assume that good intent we were talking about, which means their teams won't be working out of fear. And you can't innovate or be creative when you're working out of your fear brain. We have some practical tips we want to share for folks. So do you want to give yours and then I'll give mine?
Absolutely. So first of all, if you're doing a one-on-one meeting, if you're doing any kind of meeting, whether it's a one-on-one meeting or a staff meeting, begin with a check-in. Take just a moment, and it doesn't have to take tons and tons of time, but take a moment to see how people are doing, because we all are seeing into one another's lives in a way that we never have before. It's very unusual. I was talking to someone who said they were on a call with their boss, and their boss's kid ran through, and all of a sudden their boss seemed like much more of a vulnerable human being. So we're literally seeing into one another's living rooms. And if you take a moment to check in with people, that actually turns what could be a stress and a distraction into a positive. So take the check-in time. If you have a team, I would recommend doing shorter one-on-one meetings. Instead of a once a week one-on-one meeting, have 3 10-minute meetings every week, because a lot happens in a week right now, and you don't get the kind of texture of what's going on for people right now that you did before, when you just would walk by them and kind of see how they were. So try having shorter meetings. Also, sometimes shorter meetings are easier to fit into home chaos for people, I think. A third tip is be conscious of what you can do asynchronously, because that tends to be more efficient and convenient, and what you need to do synchronously. So tasks can get done asynchronously. Bonding needs to be synchronous. So there are times when, for example, we're going to show you a video clip in a moment, and it's very nice and different when everybody is watching the same thing at the same time than just emailing it to everybody and saying, watch it on your own time. I think if you have a big team in a different time zone, occasionally work on that time zone. It's a little bit of a pain in the neck. You're up at odd hours, but you create more synchronous time for them. If you can do that, if you can pull that off. And finally, make listening tangible. Be very conscious also of how much time everyone is speaking. There's evidence that shows that teams on which everyone speaks roughly the same amount of time actually perform better than those where one person dominates. So if you want, get yourself an app and measure what percentage of a meeting you talk. And if you talk more than your fair share, learn how to shut up a little bit. That's my struggle. And if you talk less than your fair share, remember that you're not doing anybody any favors to withhold your thoughts. Sharing your thoughts is an act of generosity.
Here are my 5. Listen to the end of everyone's sentence before you respond. So in improvisation, we have an actual exercise where you have to start your sentence with the last word the other person said, and then they have to do the same. Try that exercise, and you are going to realize that you don't listen to the end of sentences. You start planning your response, but listen to the end. You might, learn some information. Seed the need to be right. Avoid group mind and instead utilize group intelligence. We've all seen the studies on the importance of diversity in groups. You want different points of view, speak truth to power, those sorts of things. Make sure there's a clear meeting agenda and that everyone is actually aware of it. I'm saying this virtually because it's really, really important, but you will also recognize that we needed it before. So if we learn anything out of this nightmare, it will be like shorter meetings with clear agendas that everyone knows in advance. Designate one person to lead and run the meeting. These virtual meetings are a performance. You are on a stage and you need a director. You do not want directorless ensembles running around. That is dangerous. And keeping in line with the performance aspect, good lighting, facing towards a window is good. No need to be in a suit and tie, but don't wear a bathrobe. Pick a good stage, a spot in your home that is as quiet as possible, and you won't be distracted or become a distraction to others. But then also recognize, use the cute dog or cat coming in. Let your kids say hi. We actually love that. That has happened on so many of my meetings, and it is made for, as Kim said before, a real authentic experience. So those are some of our tips for you.
Thank you all so much for coming. It was great to have a moment of community with everyone. We will get through this together.